What's going on, guys? Tracing up here in the garage with the R6 for today's video, how to remove the rear tire. Let's go. In this case, let's just say that you are removing your rear wheel to take it to a shop to get a new tire on it. So now that the scenario is set, let's go ahead and get to it. All right, step number one. With the rear tire on the ground, we're gonna go ahead and loosen the rear axle nut. Let's go ahead and do that. So we'll grab our size 32, grab my breaker bar here, and we'll loosen the nuts. That is good. Let's move on to step number two. Step number two, go ahead and lift the rear of the bike into the air so you have enough space to actually take the rear wheel out. You have a couple of options when it comes to this. I personally use a jack with a couple of wooden blocks, which then goes right up against the exhaust right there and then lifts the back end up. Or you can even just grab your stand, your rear wheel stand, put the rear wheel stand up, especially if you're working on the ground. However, I got the luxury of using a lift, so I will be using a lift today and my jack. So let's go ahead and raise this guy up in the air. Step number three, now that the bike is up in the air, as you can see, there is space between the rear tire and the lift. We're gonna go ahead and entirely remove the axle nut off the rear axle right now, and we'll put that aside. Step number four, we're gonna go ahead and now remove the rear axle. Mind you, this shouldn't be a very hard process. However, I have previously run into seized and very bad axles and rear axle nuts that have been welded together. Very annoying to deal with. However, this is a fairly new bike, so I should be able to just push on it like so. You take the massive washer or ring, put it right there. And now we've got the space to take our axle block out. We're gonna put that aside as well. So now I'm just gonna lift up the rear wheel just a tiny bit with my hand as I'm pushing the axle through. Go ahead and continue to lift up the back of the tire, and then the axle comes out like so. So with the axle out, I'm gonna go ahead now, take out the axle block right here and place that on my left side of the bike. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, step number five. At this point, axle's out. We've taken off the two axle blocks. We're gonna actually just move the wheel forward as far as it can go, and then we're gonna grab the slack from the chain from the bottom and then move it to the side like that. And at this point, we have now removed the chain from the rear sprocket. All right, step number six. We're actually going to now pull on the wheel. We're gonna remove the rear wheel slowly. As we do that, the caliper over here is gonna get in the way of the actual rim. You can't take it out without removing the caliper. So I'm gonna pull the wheel back. That's gonna give me some space with the caliper. We're gonna pull this area right here out of the slot that's made for it along the swing arm, and then we're gonna pull it out and put it on this side. Now what I generally like to do is once I'm at this stage, I like to take a rag and put it on this side of the caliper, just so it doesn't scuff up the outside of the swing arm while we're doing everything else. So we got that part done. The last part is to just take the wheel and roll it out. Step number seven, we're gonna go ahead and remove the spacers from each side of the wheel. This is the left side right here. We'll put that down for a second. And then there is the right side spacer. Two little spacers that come out. Now I suggest removing these two spacers and putting them aside. And that's just in case the shop doesn't realize that the spacers are still in there and it falls out on the way to the shop or even at the shop. Step number eight, we are going to remove the rear sprocket assembly along with the cush drive. We're gonna remove this right here. So that is the rear sprocket assembly. We'll put that aside. And you're also gonna remove these rubber dampeners or the cush drive. We're gonna take these guys out as well, put these aside. One more thing I wanna mention before you do send out your wheel to the shop, you might wanna actually just tape down this area right here, just so this spacer right over here doesn't actually go and fall out on the way to the shop. This spacer is definitely not gonna be something that's gonna be lost. The shop should definitely know that this is there. However, I do sometimes just tape it off just in case, obviously, you know, it comes off during the trip. And there you have it. The rear wheel is now off the motorcycle and at this point ready to be taken to the shop for them to replace the tire. Now, before we take the rear wheel and put everything back together and put it back on the bike, I personally like to go around and clean everything. I'm gonna go ahead and clean the entire sprocket inside and out. And I'm gonna clean these guys and inspect them just to make sure everything looks good. Let's go ahead and clean this guy up before we go ahead and put everything together. Okay, all clean. Look how nice and shiny that is. What? What? One thing I do want to mention, this is a perfect time once it's nice and clean. I mean, even before it's nice and clean, you can go ahead and take your finger and run it on the inside of the tooth. You can run your fingers on the inside and on the tip. And at this point, if you feel any sort of hooking from either side of the sprocket, it's time to change the sprocket. I don't feel any sort of hooking, anything like that. So the rear sprocket's gonna rub back on the rear wheel. Okay, so now we've got our wheel back from the shop with the brand new tire on it, and it's ready to go back onto the bike. First things first, we're gonna go ahead and install the Cush Drive rubber dampeners. Some bikes have different systems, but for the most part, it is the same. Now we're gonna grab our sprocket that is nice and clean, and we're gonna go ahead and put it back on the bike. We're gonna put some pressure on each side, and now we're gonna make sure the sprocket is nice and flush and pushed all the way in. Okay, time to now reinstall the wheel onto the bike. All we gotta do is take these steps from before and do them in the reverse order. So let's go ahead and start the reinstall process. Okay, so once we have our spacers where they need to be, we're gonna go ahead and grab our chain. We're gonna lift it past the swing arm right over here, in between the swing arm and the wheel, and we're gonna slowly push the wheel forward a tiny bit. And now at this point, we just wanna let the chain hang on like so, and then leave the tire where it is. All right, so the chain is where it needs to be. We're gonna go ahead and now remove this rag, and we're gonna move the rear caliper slowly. We're gonna move it back on to where it needs to be. Now, the most important part, remember guys, is this locator right here. It needs to go into that slot on the inside of the spring arm. So we're gonna go ahead and position that now, like so. So it is in the slot. As you're doing that, the rotor is actually going to fall into place in between the brake pads. We're going to go ahead and push it all the way forward and up. And then we're going to push the rear tire in. Mind the spacer right there because it does need some space. And then I'm going to make sure the other side is good. And once I lift up the chain with my left hand, you can push the wheel forward and put the chain on all the way. And at this point, you'll be able to see that it's actually in there and the caliper is nicely snug into where it needs to be. Let's not forget to put our axle blocks in. Take the axle block and push it right up against that nut, the nut for the chain adjustment. We're gonna grab the other block as well, put that block in its place. And at this point, we are ready for the axle. All right, here comes the axle. We're gonna put the axle back in through the wheel. However, this is one thing I do wanna touch upon. I personally have the grease, and I usually put grease on the axle whenever I do take it out of the motorcycle. Now, does everybody have grease at home? No, not necessarily. If you decide to do this on your own, it's highly recommended to put grease on it. It will stop your axle from seizing. Now, in this case, this is a fairly new bike. There was already grease on the axle when I took the axle out in the first place. I actually cleaned off all the grease and then put my own. Can you put the axle back on without putting any grease on? Technically you could, and a lot of people do. However, it is highly recommended that you do put grease on your axle before putting it back. So we're gonna go ahead and start and put the axle back through the wheel. So now I've lowered the rear of the bike to the same level as the wheel, and as you can see straight through, and the axle will go in much easier. All right guys, now at this point, before I go ahead and torque the rear axle nut, I'm gonna go around and just double check everything. We're gonna go ahead and check the chain tension. That looks good. Chain alignment looks good. We're gonna go ahead and take a look at the caliper. The caliper is in its place. We're gonna come over here. We're actually gonna push on the rear brake just to get those pads seated back onto the rotors. So that looks good. And now we're gonna go ahead and grab our torque wrench and go ahead and torque this to 80 foot-pounds. So we're gonna go ahead and torque this guy down to 80 foot-pounds, which is right there. That noise lets me know that it is at 80 foot-pounds. And that is it, guys. The rear wheel is back on the motorcycle, torqued down properly, everything's in its place, and we are good to go for our next ride. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, smash that subscribe button if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell for future videos with the R6. Until the next one, guys.